When I graduated college, I worked for Mennonite Central Committee, a parachurch organization, nonprofit, got programs all across the world, and I focused on anti-racism education. That was my focus. I had an office in Deep South Texas, right on the border where I grew up, and as a young Mexican-American kid, I would travel there to Philadelphia, Mississippi. I would travel to New Orleans. I would travel all across the South and into black and brown churches for the most part in and across the state of Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And that work was transformative. That work is what got me asking questions as I learned about African American history, asking questions about my own story and about the role of Latinos and Latinas in these United States and the fights for democracy and for civil rights and so forth. Oftentimes, we're not a part of the narrative. Our stories are often excluded or marginalized. And so I didn't grow up learning anything. Even though I grew up, I could walk to Mexico from my house, literally to Matamoros from Brownsville, where I grew up. My dad was a minister, and so we had ministers from Matamoros walk on Sunday mornings, come to church with us. And that proximity didn't translate into a kind of education of Latinidad in the United States. And so it was something that I was very intentional about and came out of my experience working in the church. And, you know, I'm really just honored to be here, this morning. And, one of my experiences with Mennonite Central Committee and in the anti-racism work that I took part of, which, by the way, focused a lot more on black-brown relationships. So I wasn't as interested in these sort of vertical relationships between Latinos and whites or African Americans and whites. As important as that conversation is, I was much more interested in black-brown conversations and interethnic conversations, multi-ethnic coalitions, and so forth. But I remember this probably was, 20, 25 years ago now, going to Washington, D.C. and spending an entire day with Ruby Sales. And so when I'm reading the bio, when I'm learning about Jonathan Daniels and so forth, it's sort of coming full circle for me in terms of the importance of this work and what it is that we do. I remember being there in her home an entire day and learning from her, and really just sort of soaking in as much wisdom as I could. I think it's what really gravitated me towards not only academic study, but then also making sure that I am participating in student movements and working with young people that today are facing or are asking many of the same questions that the people that I interview from the late 1960s were asking. Is this country gonna make it? Are we going to survive? Are we going to go into a civil war? These were similar questions that were raised in 1969. Remember that in the 1960s, the kind of violence that erupted, the rebellions and so forth that erupted in the 1960s, the historian Elizabeth Hinton writes that the violence in the 60s, the only comparison we have is to the Civil War in terms of people that died, that lost their lives and so forth. And so that era, it's interesting to me to be in a classroom with young people today that are asking a lot of those very same questions. I think she's watching me right now, and she's very proud of me. I think Lydia, I want to introduce you all this morning to Canon Lydia Lopez. Have any of you ever heard of Canon Lydia Lopez? So you will after today, you're going to this morning. I was not going to come to an Episcopal church where she attended church at Church of the Epiphany in Lincoln Heights neighborhood in Los Angeles for many years, and then All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena in her later years. And every time that I would go, and I first met Lydia probably around 2014, 2015, and started making trips to Los Angeles, and I would sit with her in her apartment, and then followed her into her nursing home in the retirement community where she spent her final days, and learned a tremendous amount from her. I was fascinated with her, and she was super fascinated with me. How can you be Mexican American and Mennonite? I don't understand that. Can you help me understand that? And so, aren't you Chicano? And I said, yes, ma'am, I am. And, but here's what happened. Lord, here we go. But all of that was, I think, part of a long relationship and friendship that I had with Lydia, who's a bit of a, she's a bit of a superstar in Los Angeles. She passed away in January of 2023 on MLK Day. She passed away. And the Episcopal Church, All Saints, is now fundraising to open a community center in her name, in her honor, in the city of Los Angeles. Community Center for Immigrant Rights. And they had a fundraiser earlier this year, and I went out to participate in it. And as I'm there, I'm recognizing Edward James Olmos. You remember the actor Edward James Olmos? Everybody know who Edward James Olmos is? Exactly, right, yeah. American Me and Mi Familia and countless classics. And he's there, and here I am just casually talking to Edward James Olmos like it's no big deal. And he's like telling me all these incredible stories of Lydia, stories that I did not know and had no idea of. So let me just jump into this because Dad was a preacher and we never kept to the time except when the Cowboys were playing. That's when Dad had to cut it, and the Cowboys aren't playing today. So But anyway, I'm gonna try to be good, y'all. I'm gonna try to make it. Lydia, as you see a picture of her there, was born in 1942 in a small unincorporated section of Los Angeles called Jimtown. 605 highway runs through that very neighborhood now, in a stretch between Beverly Boulevard and Whittier Boulevard. In the 1960s, she attended Cal State LA, and shortly after that, she started working with the East Los Angeles Welfare Council. It was there at the welfare office where she was working one afternoon in 1968 that her boss invited her to a demonstration that was taking place on the corner of Temple and First. This was around near and around downtown. She joined in that morning. She was dressed in her three-piece knit suit and heels. Lydia was always dressed to the nines, okay? She never went anywhere without being just, dressed beautifully. But she didn't know what the demonstration was about. It turns out the demonstration was a show of support for the East Side 13, a group of young Chicanos who had been indicted by a grand jury on June 1st of 1968 on conspiracy charges stemming from the East LA walkouts. In 1968, high school students in Los Angeles walked out of their high schools in droves. They not only did that in Garfield High School in Los Angeles, but that inspired a movement across the Southwest. Folks, somewhere around 20,000 young people walked out of high schools, Mexican American mostly, walked out of their high schools in 1968 from South Texas to Southern California. And these East Side 13 were being tried on these conspiracy charges stemming from these East LA blowouts. On these conspiracy charges of planning, of instigating these walkouts. And these are some photos from those walkouts. The walkouts kicked off on March 5th, 1968, when students began protesting at Garfield High School, and it spread to other campuses to decry the shortcomings of public schools in Los Angeles barrios, right? Mexican Americans at this time in Los Angeles, even though Los Angeles used to be part of Mexico, are essentially an invisible minority. People do not know who these young people are. At that moment in her young life, Lydia walked into history without even knowing it. The walkouts, these high school walkouts, are viewed as a turning point in the political development of the nation's Mexican American community. It was there at that demonstration that she first heard of the Church of the Epiphany. Of course, there were clergy at this march, right? This is a picture outside of Church of the Epiphany. Every church should look like this, like on a Monday, Tuesday, Saturday afternoon. This is a bunch of probably the most active and radical Chicanos and Chicanas in Los Angeles were hanging out at Church of the Epiphany, the Episcopal Church that by the time in 1968 was already the center of activity for young Mexican-American activists. The Episcopal Parish, located in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Lincoln Heights, was embellished in papel picado when Lydia first showed up into that church. She remembers hearing mariachis playing in a church. She recalled being overwhelmed with emotions as she saw how a place of worship had embraced her Mexican-American identity. In an interview years later, she said this. She said, "I wept because I needed a place as a Chicana, and I needed a place as a Christian to call home." The church was home to a flourishing Chicano movement in Los Angeles. This is Corky Gonzalez, who was a major national leader from Denver, holding a meeting inside of that church. It was largely due, the fact that this church was the center of this Chicano movement, was largely due in part to the work of Reverend Canon John Luce, who served the church from 1965 to 1973 and cultivated a sense of communion between church and community, and especially with the young radicals. The church became a gathering place. It's where the activists organized around Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. It's where leaders met to plan the East LA high school student walkouts that Lydia was a part of, protesting the inequities of their schools, as well as the historic Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War draft. Labor leader Cesar Chavez gave speeches in the church hall, and years later the church played a role in helping Central American refugees that were fleeing war in Central America. And today the church has earned a spot on the National Register of Historic Places, the official list of sites worthy of preservation in the United States. So this church is a big deal. The building is, and it's associated with housing young radicals like this. You heard a little bit about the young radicals, the Puerto Ricans that I was talking about in New York City. This is the Chicano version of that radicalism. But to kind of set that context and to kind of help you sort of understand and to frame Lydia's life, I want to go back and I want to take a step back into history, because I realize that for many of you, this might be the first time that you're hearing anything about Latino civil rights. Some of you might know it all, maybe, but some of you, this might be the first time. So I want to take a step back and maybe provide some historical context. I'm a historian, you're stuck with me here, it is what it is. So there are different historical moments that I could begin with, but I want to take you to where I'm from, all right? I grew up in Brownsville, Texas, the southernmost tip of Texas. If you see that, you recognize that. I often draw Texas on the board for my students, and they're always very disappointed at the way that I draw. They think it's an offense, actually. So if you ever hear anything from my students about how bad he is at drawing Texas and how that offends them as Texans, then you'll know where that's coming from. But I thought I'd do something nice on computer this time, right? So there's different historical moments that I could begin with. But for the sake of time, let's begin with the war against Mexico in 1846. Primarily because of its singular importance in not just Chicano history, but in American history as well. The Mexican War in 1846, it unshocked slavery. It took it out of its shell as the question of westward expansion begins to take over the nation, whether slavery was going to expand with the nation's expansion as well. Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1821, and so the colonial quest had everything to do with that expansion of slavery. And that war begins in deep South Texas, right? This is where that famous, if you learn it sort of in U.S. history classes in high school, this is the moment in 1846 where the Mexican government saw the Nueces River up there upwards by about Corpus Christi as the official, unofficial emerging border between, sorry, this is moving here now. All right. Okay, that's going to stay still. See, it's active. It's like, dude, we're running out of time. You got to go. Mexico sees the Nueces upwards around Corpus Christi as the border. The United States sees the Rio Grande as the emerging border. So there's this area, this no man's land, this area that even to this day, we recognize it and see it as a kind of deconstitutionalized zone. Anytime anybody from the Rio Grande Valley needs to drive north, we have to check in with the federal government, with the Border Patrol. Any of you that do this, there are checkpoints all across the border, not right on the border, but 60 miles north of the border that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's why I always tell my international students during spring break, if you're going to South Texas, I don't care if you're going into Mexico or not, take every piece of documentation you have, because you will have to pass a checkpoint 60 miles north of that border. Well, it's in that space that a scuffle breaks out, and American soldiers are perished, Mexican soldiers shoot, there's killings, and President Polk declares famously, American blood has been shed on American soil, and gets Congress approval to attack and go into war with Mexico. That's the essence of it. The two, when we think about it, this process of colonialism and slavery cannot be separated. And I think it hopefully helps us to rethink how we teach this sort of American narrative, right? That the story of Mexicans in the United States is not just one of immigration, but it's also one of colonialism and deeply embedded with this question, this essential question of slavery in the United States. The colonial process in Mexico and what became the United States that war takes us all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And by the end of the 19th century, when the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner is concerned, folks, he's worried. What will happen to the frontier? If the frontier is where Americans develop their manliness, if that struggle with nature is what made America the exceptional place that it is, now that we've reached the Pacific, what will happen to our people? Well, we'll simply take colonialism and export it and conquer the entire hemisphere if possible, right? And take on not just a land grab, but a much more focused economic type of exploitation. This is what happens at the end of the 19th century in 1898 with the colonization of Puerto Rico, of Cuba, of Guam, Philippines, right? All of these developments that are taking forth and taking shape in terms of the positionality of the Caribbean, the thinking in terms of trade and exports and imports that are coming in and out of the country at the time, and the development of a white nation. Remember that Puerto Rico is still under colonial status, right? The island. New Mexico, Arizona, some of these states in the Southwest did not become states until there were high numbers of white people that populated those areas, or Euro-Americans that populated those areas. New Mexico does not become a state until 1912 for that reason. Immigration takes over in the 20th century primarily due to two big factors of pushing people out due to the Mexican Revolution and a recruitment of laborers. The nation was about to become involved in 1910s in World War I, and so the need for laborers becomes quite heavy, and there are a flood of workers from Mexico that come to the United States around this time. They don't just come to the Southwest, they go to Chicago, they're agricultural workers. In the later 20th century, they become steel workers. In South Chicago, garment workers, they work in the shipyards. They're working in all of these different sites and areas. And civil rights and activism are not really at the forefront because to them, they see themselves as sort of these immigrants that are coming here and then going back to Mexico. So any sort of contention they have, wage theft, suffering discrimination, whatever it may be, is a problem that they report to the consulate. It's something to go to the country of Mexico, to your home country, to take that back. It's not until the 19-teens and into the 1920s that you see a much more deep establishment of civil rights organizations in the United States. And it starts with LULAC. Everybody knows LULAC. Does that sound like a familiar one, right? The League of United Latin American Citizens, which starts in the late 1920s and one of the oldest Latino civil rights organizations in the country. And it's precisely because Latinos people of Latin American descent and Mexicans in particular are facing a deep-seated discrimination, right? Even the term Mexican becomes a racial epithet. It's no longer just a national identifier, right? To be Mexican is actually a racial group. It's seen as a kind of racialized identity, a mixture between the Spanish and indigenous populations of the Americas. So all of these groups begin to emerge. LULAC emerges out of sort of fighting this sense of discrimination. It's interesting, too, to note that legally, Latinos in this country, and in particular Mexicans, because this is the group that sort of racial ideas are coming out of, are legally considered white in this country throughout much of their history. There's only one census in 1930 where Mexican was seen as a racial identifier, and it was quickly removed by the 1940 census. So this is sort of the contradiction in doing Latino history, is that here you have, as some historians say, a group of people that are legally white and yet socially colored, right? And sort of thinking about what the realities. So the complexity of going to the courts and fighting school segregation, like they did in 1947 with the Mendez versus Westminster case in California, was how to prove discrimination to a group that the law saw as legally white, right? And these were sort of the battles and the fights that they had. On April 14th, this is a major case, Mendez versus Westminster, when Gonzalez and Felicitas Mendez, two California farmers, sent their children to a local school. Their children were told that they would have to go to a separate facility reserved for Mexican-American students. The Mendez family, which was Puerto Rican and Mexican, recruited similarly aggrieved parents from local school districts to form and put together a federal case that would challenge school segregation. Unlike the later Brown case, the families did not claim racial discrimination, as Mexicans were considered, as I noted, legally white, but rather discrimination based on ancestry and supposed language deficiency that denied their children their 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law. So understanding Mexican schools that emerged, school segregation with Latinos, understanding that this was not part of a law. This was not in the same way that it was directed against African Americans, where this was the law of the land. This was a sinister practice that was implemented by local school superintendents, local principals, that did not see and understand Mexicans to be as equal to white Americans at that time. The case became an important precedent for Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall follows closely this case. African American lawyers are watching closely to what Mexican American lawyers and other scholars and activists are doing to end segregation in schools. Another important case that takes place, the Felix Longoria case, World War II veteran who's denied burial rights in his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas in 1948. His case galvanizes Latino civil rights. If you know anything about our community, you know that there is a strong military tradition in terms of people that have served all the way dating back to World War I, World War II, certainly Vietnam and the wars that we have had since. For the first time, this became a national issue when the body of Felix Longoria, who died in battle in 1948, is denied burial rights in his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas. Dr. Hector P. Garcia, who was a medical doctor, World War II veteran himself in Corpus Christi, contacts at that time Senator Lyndon Johnson and gets help to make sure that this veteran is given proper burial rights. That exchange, and Senator Johnson delivers. Private Felix Longoria is currently at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., in large part due to what Dr. Hector Garcia made happen, and certainly with the help of Senator Lyndon Johnson. And this is in 48 and in the 50s. This is something that becomes a staple of later Johnson's presidency in terms of fighting and passing civil rights legislation. As problematic as he was, his experiences with the Mexican American population are what got him to understand what this civil rights struggle was about. So mid-century was a critical time for Mexican-American activists to prove that discrimination, in fact, did exist. And this is what they did. LULACers wearing their... This is a picture. I'll explain to you all. This is a picture of Mathis, Texas. Mathis is just outside of Corpus Christi, Texas, small agricultural community. And what LULAC activists did in Texas was hop in their vehicles, drive around the state, take pictures of the discrimination, segregation in schools, and the ways that laborers were being treated, the living conditions of laborers, wage theft that existed, and so forth. They knew that they needed to take pictures and photographs because otherwise people would not believe them. And so LULAC was good about this. They would take notes and put the photograph there and show them. And this is a picture taken on April 11th, 1948 of one of the Mexican schools that existed in this small agricultural town of Mathis, Texas. And I'll quickly move through these here. But they did this as they were building their cases to end segregation of Mexican-American students. If you see the notes that they write, I don't know if you can read that from there, but inside it says, inside the classroom of the newest edition of this surplus building showing the bareness of the wall, overcrowded conditions, improper equipment. It's a hothouse in the summer, as you can imagine, and an icebox in the winter. The outdoor restrooms that existed, and by contrast, if you were white and living in Mathis, that's the school that you went to. This was powerful, right? This was a powerful testament in terms of what it was that Mexican Americans were experiencing. These were the labor camps, the Mathis labor camps that replicated in different parts of the state of Texas. They called them avisperos in Spanish, or wasp nests, because everybody was just sort of huddled so closely together. When my family was on the migrant trail in the late 1950s and 60s, picking cherries in Traverse City, Michigan, and tomatoes in northwestern Ohio, these are the same kinds of living conditions that they experienced in the late 50s and 60s in places like Ohio and Michigan. And it's through the work of LULAC and these activists that were taking pictures and proving for the first time that this discrimination against Mexican workers in particular, and many Puerto Rican workers that were also coming from the island, was in fact real, and something needed to be done about it. And nobody contributed to the changing life of agricultural workers more than Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in 1962 didn't have anything. It's not like they had a savings account. It's not like they had, broad support from the unions or anything like that. They were just both migrant workers and both people that cared deeply about starting a movement. And in 1962, they both left a community service organization in Los Angeles, which was not interested in organizing farm workers. This was a very difficult group of people and workers to organize. So they go to Delano, the center of agricultural power in Central California, and they start their movement. And they start, as you can see, NFWA. They start first in 62 as the National Farm Worker Association, and La Virgen de Guadalupe is front and center. Faith was critical to this movement. If nothing else, when Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are going door to door, knocking on the doors of homes of workers, trying to get them to join the union and be a part of this movement, this was essential. Faith was essential to establishing that movement. So back to Lydia. So this is the world that Lydia is born into, right? A world that doesn't recognize her, a world that doesn't see her, a world that doesn't acknowledge her Mexican-American heritage, a world that disregards her as simply good for labor, simply good for working in the fields, no prospects of education, and so forth. As I mentioned, she's born in 1942 in an unincorporated section of Los Angeles called Jimtown. When Union Pacific tracks were built adjacent to the San Gabriel River, families living along that riverbed were displaced beginning in the 1940s. In the 1950s, when plans were made to build the 605, freeway came through. Remember, this is a moment in the middle part of the 20th century when the country is changing dramatically in terms of highways that are destroying established communities. When the 605 came through, the mostly working class ethnic Mexican population, which fluctuated, this was a neighborhood of about 800 to 1,200 people, they were all forced out. Lydia's family was one of those families. Her father and mother were both born in Mexico. Her mother was born in Durango. Father was born in Chihuahua. Her mother came to the States in 1927, and her father came a few years before that. Her father was a church planter, y'all. Lydia was raised Baptist. He was a preacher and a steel mill worker. Her mother was a stay-at-home mom, a seamstress, and also quite active in the church. As a child, Lydia memorized Bible verses for fun, y'all. She memorized them for fun. She attended vacation Bible school at Iglesia Bautista Betania and grew up in a religious social world of church youth groups and Christian schools in and around East Los Angeles. When she starts attending Church of the Epiphany and meets Father Luz, the connection of faith and politics and faith and activism explodes. It becomes central in her life. She doesn't understand that you could do anything different. How could you be a Christian and not be involved in the civil rights movement? It was also just really great to be at a church, to be part of Epiphany, as everybody would say, was the biggest party in town. Lydia falls in love with a young man named Fred, who was a brown beret. He was part of these radical young people in these movements. And one afternoon, I don't know if it was an afternoon or an evening, I'm just going to tell you it was an afternoon, Fred, who's Catholic, invites Lydia to church. And Lydia says, sure, I'll go with you to church. Let's go to St. Basil's Catholic Church, a beautiful new building that had just opened up. The Catholic Church had spent somewhere upwards of $3 million erecting a brand new building just west of downtown. And as Lydia's approaching this space, she notices that they're actually not there to go to Mass. It's actually Christmas Eve, December 26, 1969. If you remember 1969 from this sermon, I'm not in New York anymore. I'm in LA, but it's at the same time that this is happening, where a young group of people, she realizes Fred takes her to meet a group called Católicos por la Raza, or Catholics for the Race, or Catholics for the People. And she joins this protest that's taking place outside of this church on Christmas Eve. What she didn't know is that night, Fred had taken her to church under false pretenses. They were actually there to disrupt Christmas Eve Mass. How many of you have ever been to Christmas Eve Mass? It's kind of a big deal, right? So to disrupt it or to be a part of it and to sit outside with signs that say that Christ did not own a Cadillac, because that church cost $3 million to build, and the church took scholarship funds from Mexican Americans who benefited greatly from Catholic education, certainly much more than they did from public education. Took that money away to build this building, and young Mexican Americans came out to protest, and Lydia walks into history yet again. Católicos por la Raza. That night, Cardinal McIntyre blocks the doors of the church to block the young people from coming into Christmas Eve Mass. It's a true story. There should be an enactment. I should not just be telling you this because it's so beautiful. So the youth, and it was rough. It was a little rough too. We're not going to lie. So the youth show up, and Cardinal McIntyre locks the doors. And they before they did it, they held a small mass, a group. They prayed together. They took a Holy Communion together. And they walked to the church and they were shouting, "Let the poor people in. Let the poor people in." And Cardinal McIntyre instructed his ushers, which the youth did not know, but those ushers were undercover police officers because Cardinal McIntyre knew that the young people were going to show up that night. There's always a mole, yo. COINTELPRO was deep, yo. The FBI. Anyway, they show up. The doors are locked. The young people find a way to get in. Violence ensues as these ushers begin to beat on these young people that had made it into the church. And Cardinal McIntyre, and I'm not making this up, this is really incredible, but Cardinal McIntyre signals to the choir director, start singing so we can drown out the voices of these young people, right? And so that the church can continue as normal. Start singing. And I'm looking through, the only reason I know this is because I'm looking through court documents. I'm looking through the transcription of the case. And the choir director is on the stand, and he's on the stand, and he's up there, and the lawyer asks the choir director, so what's the song that Cardinal McIntyre wanted you to sing? And he said, well, we were instructed to sing at that point, "O Come All Ye Faithful." And so right at the moment when the church choir starts to sing, "O Come All Ye Faithful," and the young people are shouting, "Let the poor people in," these two choruses are going on back and forth and back and forth. And Lydia walks into that history again. Those young people were arrested. Those young people were tried. The Methodist ministers came in to rescue the young lords in New York City. The Catholic Church threw the letter of the law at all of these young people. They served jail time and they were fined. But you can't tell that they're nervous. That's Lydia, by the way, right at the front. She was arrested that night too. And she's pregnant, by the way. She's got baby Alejandro in her tummy, and she's got a big smile. I told Lydia, you're smiling. You're coming out of the courtroom. She said, it was so exciting. I'm like, I don't know how you're excited. All of these experiences made her a known figure in LA politics, especially among the lawyers and the politicians across the city. In the 1970s, she served with multiple anti-poverty groups and welfare councils across the city. And she was a jobs orientation leader at the Chicana Action Service Center. All of this work prepared her for leadership positions that she would eventually take with the United Neighborhood Organization, a major community organization started by the Catholic Church in 1976. In 1979, she attends UNO's first formal convention, which was held at the Shrine Auditorium in downtown Los Angeles. There, Gloria Chavez was elected president and Lydia vice president. And 2 years later, in 1981, she's elected president of that. And her first, this is why I love her to death, her first action was to grant a $5,000 scholarship to the South Central Organizing Project as a way to build a coalition between African Americans and Latinos in the city, adding that politicians can no longer, quote, play the black community off of the brown community. In the 1980s, she took a staff position at La Placita Church in downtown Los Angeles, where she served as a fundraiser and media liaison for the parish at a moment when the sanctuary movement was taking off. And La Placita Church becomes a center of the sanctuary movement in central Los Angeles. And that's Father Olivares to your left there, and some of the sanctuary folks that are there as well. Father Olivares was the first to offer sanctuary, not just to Central American refugees, but also to economic migrants that were coming in from Mexico. She's told me, she said, for me, the connection was the mission. It was never, this is my pew, this is your pew. I never saw it as Roman Catholic or Protestant. As far as I was concerned, I was helping Father Olivares do his mission, and a mission that I was very much in sync with. She raised money to help Father Olivares and La Placita Church with whatever it needed and served as one of his closest confidants. While her role was mostly behind the scenes, her work was critical to the success of the sanctuary movement in Los Angeles. All the while, she remained committed to her church, first to the Church of the Epiphany in Lincoln Heights, and later to All Saints in Pasadena. Lopez was an activist. She was an intellectual. She was a worker. She was a mother. She was a religious leader. In her life's work, and I just did this really quick, her life's work takes on that narrative that bridges the 60s with the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, the Chicana and Chicano and sanctuary movements, and shows us how faith politics fueled much of these Latino movements for social change. For all their work for racial, economic, and immigrant justice, Latina and Latino religious leaders remain, for the most part, outside of these broader conversations on religion and civil rights. She served the Diocese of Los Angeles and the wider Episcopal Church for more than 50 years, y'all, and was appointed canon of the Diocese of Los Angeles in recognition of her lifelong commitment to faith-based justice work in the Latino community. Although her life transitioned, as I mentioned, in January of 23, Her story, legacy, and commitment to faith-based politics continues to inspire communities of spirituality, solidarity, and struggle today. She called herself a pushy broad. She's like, Felipe, I'm a pushy broad. I'm like, okay, Lydia, whatever. This Mexican Baptist turned outrageous Episcopalian. This religious activist, a person with a strong conviction and a firm believer, this person that I grew to love. This is me and Lydia after one of our interviews. Became an important player in two of the most important social movements of the 20th century, the Chicana movement and the sanctuary movement of LA. It says much, I think, about the good that religion can do in politics, but also shows us how interconnected these two social movements were. As critical voices against U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy and its belief of solidarity across the Americas emerges, and we see that most clearly through the life of Canon Lydia Lopez. Thank you all very much.